I always want to begin by following that bumper with, like, this town ain't big enough for the both of us. Which I love that bumper. So it's what's locally, we are celebrating a St. Patrick's Day, and it's also happening all across the world. There's green, and there's celebrations and dying rivers in some cities, and like, it's all in good fun. Of course, lots of legends attributed to our friend Patrick, one of which is that the reason why there are no snakes in Ireland is because Fair Patrick, with his gusto and strength, kind of chased them all away, right? He got them out of there. And that's one of the things that gets attributed to him, and why, if you were looking for a nice snake-free place to spend a journey, look at Ireland, right, as a possible place. I'm getting no kickbacks from the Ireland Tourism Bureau by saying such a thing, just a fun story that gets attributed to him. Well, the text what we're going to look at today, I think it's appropriate that we're going to look at this text today because our friend Moses could really have used Patrick in this particular story because this is a story where we're going to talk about snakes. So before we do that, I just want to give you a sense of those of you who are just maybe coming in and interacting with this series for the first time, these desert days. What are we talking about? Because it's not a desert climate that we live in, right? We're talking about those moments where in your life, the circumstances are harsh, extreme, difficult, the relationships around you feel strained, there is uncertainty that is like happening in the midst, and it's all kind of happening at once. Resources are scarce, as they often are in the desert, and sometimes those things are like literal things that are happening in your life, right? You might literally, at some point in your journeys, if you are an adventurer of sorts, get trapped in a desert at some point in time. You ran out of gas. But what's probably more true is that you will go through times where metaphorically these things feel true, where my resources are scarce, my relationships are strained, the conditions are emotionally, spiritually, physically, mentally taxing, and it's all converging upon me. And it may be a thing you go through, but if you don't even go through that, if you just have a happy, pleasant life, what may be true is that you will endure walking with people who are going through those things. Right? So whether it's 40 days, 40 weeks, 40 years, 40 hours, you are going to walk into seasons like that. You may be in one today. You may find yourself in one tomorrow you weren't planning for. Okay? What we've talked about in this series is how do we look at this Old Testament journey in the Hebrew Scriptures that this group of people called the Israelites go on, this gap between this enslavement that they experience in this land called Egypt and the freedom that they experience in the promised land, this time between where they are in the desert and not just experiencing not just experiencing harsh circumstances, but being exposed to things about their own heart. What does their story show us about ours? What does their story and their longings, what can we put in our head as we face our desert days? What can we put in our heart as we face our desert days? What can we do with our hands as we help other people face their desert days? Numbers 21 is where we're going to be, verses 4 through 9. I'm going to read a verse or two at a time, make sure we just have the full context based on other weeks in case it's been a minute or you're hearing all of this for the very first time. And then we'll ask some good questions about what it means for us and why this ancient text bears any kind of weight for your Sunday afternoon or beyond. Okay? Numbers 21. They traveled from Mount Or along the route to the Red Sea to go around Edom. Now, if you'll recall, remember we're going to a promised land. The Israelites are making their way there, and we're at the point of the story. Josie and Lindsay gave us some early days of the journey. We're now towards the finish line. So imagine the end of your road trip where you've tried all the tricks, you've tried the playlist, you've tried the movies, you have to go to the bathroom, but you don't want to stop again, and just the surliness that begins to happen in moments like that. We used to take this trip from Indianapolis to Annapolis. Get your head around that as we were transitioning to move to Maryland, and hitting the state of Pennsylvania was not even remotely close to the end of our trip, but it was this moment where you're like, we're finally out of Ohio. gracious. The state of Ohio goes on forever. And I know you West Coast people, you're like, shut up. You don't even know what a big state is. Like, okay, fine, I don't. But like with little toddlers and driving through the night, like Ohio was taxing. All right, so I want you to imagine the Ancarrow family and their Chrysler Town and Country, sandstone in color with the neat pack-and-go system, is making their way upon the Pennsylvania border when they start to see orange cones that are like, there are no Ancarrows coming into this state. And I'm like, well, that's funny. Someone's punking me. But then I go to AM 530, which is giving me all the traffic updates. And they're like, no, for real. The Pennsylvania National Guard is at the border. You come into PA, and we're going to have some trouble. This has not happened, by the way, right? But that's what's happening here for the Israelites. The Edomites are like, no, you will not pass go. You will not collect $200. You are not coming into our territory to make your way to the promised land. And rather than like deal with that, they go, okay, we'll go south. We'll like dodge the nonsense of Pennsylvania and we'll go to where the West Virginians are because they'll be much more reasonable. And what happens along the way is that Aaron, Moses' brother, dies. So if you were with us 2 weeks ago, Moses' sister dies 2 weeks ago. This time, Moses' brother dies. These are people that are helping for all of their nonsense and for all of the ways, like even they are questioning Moses' leadership. They have been helpful along the way, and the beginning of the end is happening in the sense that the new guard is going to emerge as the people of Israel get to the promised land. Remember last time we said Moses is going to get them to the cusp of it, but not go in with them. So Moses' brother dies, and in the process of that, the people of West Virginia, proverbially speaking, are not friendly and kind, and in the morning of Aaron's death, they like attack the Israelites, and they have to defend themselves, and they do. Long and short, they do. They're still standing. They've now survived attack. They've been threatened with attack. Like, God is continuing to provide in some really hairy circumstances, but that's what's happening in verse 4. That little detail about the travels, I think you just need the backstory when you hear, why are these people continuing to be so whiny? Why are these people continuing to be so petulant? Because they're close. They're close. They're like near the end, the beginning of the end, and they've got to go to the bathroom, and they're tired of detours, and they don't want to listen to Hotel California one more time in that awesome playlist that you put together. Like, they're just done, right? Verse 5. But the people grew impatient on the way, as we just said. They spoke against God and against Moses and said, why have you brought us out of Egypt to die in this wilderness? There is no bread, there is no water, and we detest this miserable food. Okay? Time out, and we're not going to do this one verse at a time all the time. But like, that's not true. The whole book of Numbers up to this point has been about, you're in the desert, you don't have a lot of resources, but there is like water poking out of rocks for you. There is stuff falling from the sky, and like you're not a necessarily well-formed militia, and God is delivering you into like places where you're surviving attacks. Like, can we cool it with the drama? But remember, it's 120 degrees by day, right? Conditions are harsh. Battle-weary, tired people are again going, I think we would have been better back in enslavement. I just think life in Egypt, like even amongst people who had no, they had no physical memory of living there because they were born in the desert, are beginning to do that very thing too. So look at verse 6. Then the Lord sent venomous snakes among them. They bit the people, and many Israelites died. Okay, let's make sense of this because I think let's just do some like Hebrew literature stuff. What is happening here? One of two things, right? One might be another situation where natural resources like water, bread, quail are being amplified and in a supernatural way to like get a point across here in the Gulf of Aqaba, right? That maybe what's happening here is that like God is amplifying snake population, which is native to this region, to kind of get the attention of this massive people. What may also be true is that you've found like a natural habitat where poisonous snakes are, and there's a whole outbreak. You can actually read in other battle accounts across history, like Alexander trying to march his army through an area called Gedrosia, which snakes become like a real problem on the march, and so many people are dying of snake bites that like it contributes to this larger morale and meltdown, which plays into Vizzini from Princess Bride saying, never start a land war in Asia. Like, it references moments like that. If you're wondering, like, where does that joke come from? Moments like Alexander trying to march his army through Asia and like dealing with things like snake bites. So maybe we're dealing with an infestation problem. Maybe we're dealing with a supernatural issue. Fun story. In my wife's family of origin, one of the tales they like to tell is that they had a snake come out of the bathtub like faucet, right? Like that there was a snake living in the pipe and like emerging, and that's terrifying. That is awful. And that makes me not want to live on a farm. But but you can also find stories even in the state of Maryland. There's a case that's like being litigated currently, or may have just been settled, where a family bought a house and like moved their kids in, and we're like, this house is infested with snakes. How did this pass the inspection, right? Like this is, like there are snakes coming out of places where they're not supposed to be snakes, and it's currently being sort of litigated. So here's why I'm belaboring this. I think sometimes we can get into this and we go, wait a second, like, okay, Moses, is this like a fable or a fairy tale? Is this a real thing? I think we have to keep in account. Even a book like Numbers, which gets really detailed in things like censuses, is an ancient literary style that does not match your modern government textbook. Like it's going to tell us like there's going to be these moments where these intricate details about how the camp is supposed to be formed and where the people are and how many of them there are. And then like stories like this, it's like, well, the Lord sent snakes. Well, was it supernatural? Was it natural? Like, well, Moses really isn't interested in answering that question for you, much to your frustration. What Moses is trying to point you to that you probably can relate to is the bigger question that the whole story is trying to get us to answer, which is, can God be trusted with our story? Is God good? Is God for us? Can God be trusted with our story? Is the larger theme. So I know that we might get a little bit frustrated when we're interacting with an ancient text. It's not giving us the genus, the species, the temperature, like we get the Gulf of Aqaba and we're like, okay, we can fact check that. Are there poisonous snakes there today? Okay, like if this story took place in Ireland, we might go, now hold on a second, right? So whichever it is, it's pointing to a bigger story that Moses is trying to tell us. The people came to Moses and said, we've sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us. So Moses prayed for the people. The Lord said to Moses, make a snake and put it on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live. So Moses made a bronze snake and put it up on a pole. And when anyone was bitten by a snake and looked at the bronze snake, they lived. All right, so can we just acknowledge that this is weird? Can we just call it out? That when you think about the passages of the Bible that may be relevant to your Zoom meetings, to your family transitions, to the uncertainty that you have, to the divisiveness and the polarity of our times, to the evil things happening in the world, we're like, oh, the story about a snake feels not relevant at all. So I don't want to, what we don't want to do when we come together is just become the smartest people in the coffee houses that have this great niche mastery of ancient Hebrew texts, right? What we want to try to do in our time together is ask, what on earth does a story like this mean for a moment like the one I'm in? Where my relationships feel strained, where my resources feel scarce, where there's conflict all around me, where there's uncertainty about the future, and all of that is happening at once. How does a story about snake bites and God providing healing to the people, how does that bear any weight in my story? And I want to move us toward that end in our few minutes together. Let's look at the idea of the Israelites and what we're being asked to process through the snake bite and the healing. Let's take a look at Moses, and for those of us who are trying to carry the weight of leading people who are dealing with nonsense, like what that might mean for us. And then ultimately, is this a story about a mean, angry God who's just tired of petulant nonsense? Or is God doing something different here? All right, those are what we want to consider in our few minutes together. Let's think about the Israelites really quickly. And this is a recurring theme of our series, right? The recurring theme of our series has been, there are circumstances in your life that are heavy and hard, but then there's also you processing those things, right? Did you know this? Like 1 week, a gridlock traffic jam, all of the city of Baltimore being worked on road-wise the same day. You're just like, well, I just trust the Lord. I just am not even burdened by this. And the next day, you might be breathing fire, right? You just may be like absolutely lit up. And your kids that are in the car with you, like they won't remember the 47,000 times you've told them to pick their towels up or put the whatever away, but they will remember the one time that you got really, really frustrated at someone on 83 and you said something that you should not have said amongst the young ears around you, right? Like just the reality is there are the conditions, but then there's the human response to the conditions, right? There's bad things happening in the world, but then there are the people that are like, ooh, I can exploit this for my own gain, or I can get something out of this end. And one of the things, the journey through the desert, and the journey through your desert happens to do too, is there is what happens to you, but then there's also the things that you're trusting in or responding with. Right? The coping mechanisms. And which is the poison? Is the poison the bad things that happen, or is the poison the response? And that is one of the things the Israelites are learning, that their life in the promised land is not going to not have difficulty, complications, hard days, but their unwillingness to trust God with their story is a poison that is destroying the inner fabric of their community, right? And it's happening around them, and it's happening in them. And so one of the things I think we can pay attention to in a moment like this is to sort of say, the snake bite is a shadow of a bigger problem, which is, again, it's an attention-getting moment, to be sure, where like the people of Israel are being asked to confront the real poison. The poison that says, like, you get delivered from battle, you get food falling from the sky, you get water pouring out of rocks, you get to say whatever you want about my man Moses, and yet, anytime things go sideways, you lose your mind and you trust in other things. You take that into the promised land, spoiler alert, they do, and you will take a pure, wonderful place, and you will poison it. And they do. Like there's a greater poison than just the circumstances of the snake. What does the serpent mean in ancient Hebrew literature? It's a reference to deception, right? Like you might be familiar with Adam and Eve. It's not just ancient Hebrew literature that likes to personify snakes as like deception, slithery, whatever, right? What do the snakes represent in this case, right? This is the very same deceptions. That life's better when everything's easy and everything's beautiful and nothing hurts and we get what we want as soon as we want it. We'll trust God. If God would just pour out water from rocks and God would just spell out in the sky where I'm supposed to go to grad school and God would just tell me in this career transition what's next, I'll trust God with my story. And this text goes, not so fast. Not if you don't examine the things beneath the surface. So to look at spiritual maturity not as sort of holding all the things together in a way that's like, man, I've built a great life for myself, but to say, hey, life is going to go sideways, things are going to be uncertain, there will be times when resources are scarce. What do I trust in when those moments arrive? And to pay attention to that happening around us, what I love about this season of Lent, Christians often, people who follow Jesus often, are sort of personified as these naive people that have their head in the sand about all the things that are happening in the world. Talk about resurrection and good vibes and coming together, and then you're like, yeah, but Haiti, Gaza, Ukraine, Baltimore, my family, my life, my story. Christian, maybe you're the idiot. Pull your head out of the sand and look around you. And what this season and this moment is intended to do, the season of Lent, is like to say, no, we with full vision see those things. And we feel the weight of those things. So actually, what we're acknowledging is the need for a response beyond just a human one, right? The human in me, the human in you, the guy who can walk away from coffee and provide clean water. Yeah, we can do our part. But there's a greater longing and a greater need for resurrection that will not be one government getting it right or one thing being there's a whole bigger thing at play here. So the work of Lent is not to bury our head in the sand and say everything's beautiful and nothing hurts, but it's to say it stinks to get bit by the snake. And it's hard to watch that happening around us. And it's hard, this is the other part of it that we pay attention to in the Lenten season, is to see it in us. Right? It's because it's one thing to be irritated by everyone else's petulance and nonsense and their tantrums and their fighting. But Lent takes a sober look at your own soul. What's the state of your own heart? As all the stuff's happening around you, what are you learning about the things you trust in? Because on the other side of that meeting, and why you might be frustrated about the traffic gridlock, is that you may just have, the person that you're meeting with, you're like, man, I have an unhealthy attachment to control or approval that getting stuck in a traffic jam will show me about me. Or that I have no margin in my life, that busyness is my God and achievement is my thing, and so when any variation happens, I breathe fire. Look at the actual poison. It's not the circumstances, it's what you functionally trust in. The serpent represents the deceptions, right? The poison of our own hearts. And one of the things, I really struggled with when I was a new follower of Jesus and I was hearing people talk about, I was like, hey, I can say a word that's going to get me detention and not get struck by lightning. So, this is not just, behave, wait, so if I modify my behaviors, why modify my behaviors? God is graceful and good, and, why? I really struggled with that, as some of you might too. And what the invitation, of course, by people who had been on that journey a while before me is, to say, hey, Christianity is not just behave yourself, it's be reconciled to the one who can actually cure us of the poison within. Be reconciled to the one that can actually bring healing, that can actually bear the weight of our trust. So many of my plans, I'll give you another snake infestation story from the state of Maryland. In Poolesville, Maryland, which is that way, we played them in sports a lot. I went to Smithsburg, I played Poolesville a lot in playoff games and things like that. So I remember Poolesville, they're sturdy, hardy folks that, they are resourceful people. One person decided in Poolesville, Maryland, that the snake infestation in his house was a problem that he was going to take care of, and he didn't need a professional. He was going to smoke out the snakes. He's going to smoke out the snakes through hot coals. And you know what he actually did instead? He burned his house down. You can see video evidence of that. That's a thing that happened actually in the past 5 years. And that's a good reminder for me. So many of us in this room who are achievers, we're controllers, we behave ourselves, we kind of follow the rules. This is even what we saw on Moses a couple weeks ago. That you will go through things in life that will bring you to the end of yourself. Your ability to hold it together publicly and not have public tantrums, and your ability to not but the posture that's this news is for everybody else, but I'm good. There's a thing that we have to pay attention to in us as well. The poison just isn't what is happening around you, but it also exists in you. And to take a look at the effect of sin, not just around your story, but in your story with the things you trust in. And that's not to look you in the eye and say, how dare you? You're such a naughty person. What's wrong with you? But to say, do not miss the opportunity to experience the freedom that you wish was happening in the places and spaces that occupy around you as well. That the goal of Christianity is not to just make you behave yourself, but to say, hey, what do we do about the poison? The poison wasn't dealt with in this story by like beating the snakes to death and getting angry at everybody else. It was by looking outside of themselves, right? That's the invitation. Look up at the thing that can actually bring us healing. To follow Jesus is not just to adhere to a list of behaviors and puff our chests about how great we are at following those rules and how terrible everyone else is at following those rules and how hypocritical everyone else is, but to say, I need to look up. I need to look to an actual one who can actually take care of the thing that's happening around me and is happening in me. Right? Let's think about Moses for a moment. Let's think about Moses as the intercessor. So, like Moses has dealt with so much nonsense in the past. And it's been a few minutes since we've pulled up the story. But you'll notice Moses handles things different than he did 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, Moses yelled at them, called them a bunch of rebels, took his staff, like smashed a rock, wanted to flex on them, like just like lose it in the car, which is kind of one of those things that you do that, like me, you do feel good for a moment, and then you're like, I'm having to apologize now. And I don't like to have to apologize for things, especially when I'm not wrong. But to be like, in this particular case, what does Moses do? Moses doesn't absorb the poison himself in the sense of going, this is my problem to fix and it's all on me to hold this together. Moses prays for them and then does follow the instructions given him to make something formed with his hands and like lift up the solution and point those who have been bit to it, right? When we deal with the desert seasons, particularly as a friend, it is so easy for us to do what happened 2 weeks ago, which is to put all the weight of the world on our shoulders and lash out at everyone when they resent us and they put undue burdens of trust upon us. It's a very easy impulse, and it's one that we're professional at, particularly those of us in this room that are helping people and trying to do important things in the world. Moses stays regulated this time. It's a beautiful thing. Like, as the snake bite is happening, the snake, like, this is the thing I'm sure Moses in this case, like, I don't know what to do about this. So when you face those situations where you're like, I don't know what to do about this, what does he do? He prays, he goes to God and says, asks for help, and then prays for these people by name, and then moves to, hey, I'm not the solution, but I'm going to point you to the thing that is. Right? And so when we move to this time of communion in a few moments, one of the things I would say is it's very possible when I talk about all the things that are heavy or hard in the world, that there are very specific people whose names come to mind. There's very specific places that come to mind. There's hard things that come to mind. And oftentimes in our culture, thoughts and prayers are sort of thought of as this like throwaway thing to be like, can we stop having a conversation about something hard? That's sometimes how that phrase is used, right? You notice Moses does both. There's both thought and prayer and action attached to what happens here. He goes to God, help me, I don't know what to do, I don't know where to go, but then I'm also going to do this thing that you're telling me can bring healing that doesn't make a lot of sense to Moses probably, right? And so when we think about Moses in this particular moment, I think it's a great reminder to us to say, hey, there's some of us in this room that are probably putting way too much burden upon our shoulders. And then there's probably some of us that actually need to care about what's happening around us, right? And it sounds like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth there. But I think some of you might be in the moment where you're just like, man, I am like Moses in the sense that I just feel the weight of everything going wrong in the world right now. And I don't even know what to do. Like Moses is a great example of saying, hey, Moses is not the remedy. He's pointing them to the remedy. And what if as a church, what if as individuals who call the Foundry their home, we would stop pretending that we're the remedy, but we can point to the remedy. We can point with our resources. We can point with our time. We can point with our insightful questions. We can point with our prayers to the one who can actually bring life. And then what if over here, some of us just got out of our own nonsense long enough to go, man, there are people around us who are experiencing poison. And the city I live in is just not a place for me to build my best life and move on. It's not just a place for me to go, well, you guys are doing nonsense, but I'm going to do my thing over here. Moses is again in this place which is like to be in the desert with people who are burdensome is to say, hey, sometimes the work of my hands needs to be about coming up with solutions that point people to the solution. And what would it look like in your life and story to be about that same business? We'll move to God here. I think this is one of those texts where you're like, okay, is God like a vindictive, awful meanie? Like, what is the point of a passage like this? And one of the things that's interesting, if you consider it, is like the snake bite happening and breaking out, like the solution is a pretty equitable solution, right? It's not like go kill 10 snakes and come back to me when you've done that. It's look at the crushed snake. Trust the words of Moses here that don't make sense. This is not how snake bites get solved in modern medicine. But look at this solution and live. Look at what's lifted up and live. What God is doing in this moment is to say, hey, like the answer isn't in you. The answer isn't sucking the poison out of you. It's not blame shifting to, let's kill all the snakes and chase them out of the land here. It's to say, hey, pay attention to the thing that's been lifted up so that you'll be reminded to trust the story. The New Testament has a moment where a high-functioning achiever who is elite in his culture and gets a lot of things done and would be very welcome in a modern sensibility into a neighborhood like ours wants to meet Jesus in the middle of the night because, honestly, he's not quite sure what to make of Jesus. He's not quite sure if he's a crazy person or not, but he's drawn to him. His name's Nicodemus, and he meets Jesus in the middle of the night to try and ask, like, hey, just tell me about, like, what your thing is about. Like, what's your thing? And, like, Jesus, they start having this conversation about being born again, and then Nicodemus takes it literally, maybe evasively, maybe because he's just genuinely confused. You're probably familiar, at least, like, with the visual of, like, the phrase John 3:16. You may even have heard John 3:16. It's one of the most known passages of the New Testament where Jesus says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him would not perish, but have everlasting life." Like Jesus is trying to spell out for this achiever who's a good person and is by all accounts well thought of in his community that, like, hey, the way that my healing looks, this is not about just looking the part and being religious. It's about experiencing new life, looking outside of yourself for the solution to that poison. The verses that precede John 3:16 I want to read for you because they speak to God's character in this text. Jesus says this, "Just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that everyone who believes in him may have eternal life in him. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him." Right? If we look at the snapshot of the Old Testament, we have this picture where it's like, God seems a little mean. But there's a shadow that says, keep going here. Look back at Genesis 3, where God says, I'm going to crush the snake that deceived Adam and Eve. I'm going to make war against this, and we're going to win. And look forward to a crushed snake, an image of a crushed snake, and looking at it to bring healing, to Jesus telling this cultural elite, hey, I am going to be that snake. I'm going to be the very thing that's like lifted up. And when we talk about the cross of Christ and the resurrection of Jesus, what is that really about? Well, it's about religious elites trying to stamp out Jesus because he's preaching grace and mercy. About the Roman Empire taking anybody that's any kind of existential threat to their way of life and going, hey, this is what we do with people who say there's another way than the Roman way. And taking the worst brunt of those two things, lifted up on a tree and saying, you can flex, but you won't be able to stamp this out. that that the things that we trust in for life, the things we trust in can often just permeate the poison further in our story. But that the way of Jesus and the mercy and grace extended to us from Jesus is to say, hey, this is where we find forgiveness. This is where we find life. It's not looking deeper into yourself for the answer. It's looking up at the one who was lifted up, at the one who could conquer death, at the one who conquered empire, at the one who shows a better way than the one we would construct with our own hands. And let God meet us in that place. Nicodemus had to wrestle with that story the rest of his life. We don't leave John 3 with the outcome, though we see Nicodemus show up at the burial of Jesus. The invitation, I think, for us today at the tables is to say, hey, in our story, we feel the weight of the poison happening around us in the lives of people we love, things happening in this world, and we feel so limited and small. Can we look up to the one who can help us figure out how to carry that burden properly? And if in our own story we just feel the poison of the things we trust in really getting to us, how do we come back to where the solution is found? By the one who is present, by the one who conquered death, by the one who offers forgiveness, and the one who says, look up, keep going, trust the story. There's 4 stations in this room. I just invite you today to just breathe, to rest, to wrestle, to do what you need to do, to deal with the feeling of the poison around you, the feeling of the poison in you, and to trust the one who's extending the invitation towards life. Let's pray together, and we invite you to participate in the Lord's Supper at one of our gluten-free stations. God, I am very guilty of intellectually knowing, or in my heart knowing where the thing that might bring me life, but trying to shortcut in my own deserts and trying to trust other things to give us peace in the story. And God, what we often will feel as a result of that is just feel poisoned, we feel betrayed, we feel let down, we feel confused. Thank you for the steadfastness of this invitation to look up, to look to you who conquered sin, who conquered death, who is walking with us toward life. Would you help us, God, to trust the story wherever it meets us today? In the name of Jesus we pray, amen.